Hi, I'm Allison Boyd, the Shelby County Probate Judge, and I am so excited to have the opportunity to speak to this virtual gathering of alumni and friends of Leadership Shelby County. Now, I've looked back, and I want to say for at least the past 5 or 6 years, I've had the opportunity to come in and speak to each leadership class. In each class, I have the opportunity to come in and tell them about all of the wonderful things that we get to do in the probate office and the ways that we serve the community. And I'll tell you though, in looking through my notes from years past, there is one subject that I always mention but gloss right over. And that is the topic of elections. So of course, as with everything else in 2020, we're going to do things a little differently this year. And this year, my sole focus is going to be on the topic of elections. So here we go. You can't turn on the TV or the radio or even scroll through your feed on Facebook without finding something about elections and the election process. We're bombarded by it everywhere. There's questions, there's answers, there's opinions. But the problem is that a lot of the information out there is misinformation. And some of that is by design, but some of it I really believe is just because we don't understand the process, and the process in different states and even in different counties within the same state are very different. So it's my goal throughout the next few minutes to talk to you a little bit about the processes that happen with elections. And I'm going to focus specifically on Shelby County, of course, but I'll try to give you a little bit of insight as to why some of the answers that you're hearing on TV and in your social media feeds may be a little bit different from state to state and even from county to county. So with that, let's get started. First thing that you need to understand is who's in charge of elections. That's a pretty simple answer. In every state, there's a Secretary of State, and that Secretary of State is the chief election official for that state. They set the rules. Now, the legislature makes the rules for each state, but the Secretary of State is the one who sets the rules, who promulgates the rules, and advises local election officials about those rules. In Alabama, our Secretary of State is John Merrill, and his office is responsible not only for those things in dealing with the rules, but also for collecting the oaths when they are taken by the officials that are elected. He's responsible for the campaign finance filings that are required of all political candidates and political action committees. And he's basically responsible for keeping all of the elections in line, for certifying equipment and things. Think of him as the person who handles the big picture. So then we look in Alabama to our county election officials. Now, each county is going to have an election commission. The election commission is made up of 3 individuals by statute. First, the probate judge, who is the chief election official. Second, the circuit clerk, who is responsible for handling absentee ballots and absentee voting process. And finally, the sheriff of each county. And the sheriff is responsible for security during the election process. Now, obviously, there's going to be some difference in the laws in different states, but how might you see some differences even within the same state? Well, a lot of that comes down to financial considerations. So we may have different financial capabilities in Shelby County than in Montgomery County or in Mobile County or Etowah County. So each one of our processes are going to be a little bit different based on the finances and the personnel that we have available to conduct our elections process. So it's good to understand who pays for elections. Elections are a joint venture. Elections are going to be shared, and election expenses are going to be shared by both the state and the county. If it is strictly a local election, then the county will bear all of the expenses. That works the same for municipalities like city elections. The city would bear all of the expenses. If it is a state or a federal election combined with some local positions, then the county and the state are going to split those expenses. When I say expenses, you know who pays for them, but what are we talking about? What kind of expenses go into elections? I'll tell you, before I started in the probate office, I could not have named all of these, and I certainly didn't think of all of these different things that go into elections, but there are a lot of expenses involved in elections. So first, there are the election equipment. Those are the machines that we put the ballots into that count the ballots. They are the poll pads that you check in with when you come in on election day. Every precinct must, by federal law, have a HAVA machine, which is a machine that allows people with disabilities to be able to vote more independently. We also have just the general ballots and other just paper supplies and things. So you have to print all of the ballots. We have envelopes that everything has to go in at the end of the night. What about the pens that you use when you come to vote? The stickers, the ever so popular I voted stickers, we have to pay for those. We have to pay for extension cords to plug everything in. We have to pay for surge protectors to make sure that we don't have a disaster on election day with the machines malfunctioning. So all of those things are going to go into election expenses. Other things that we have to address would be the poll workers. They're probably the most important part of our election day. Right now in Shelby County, we would average about 500 to 600 poll workers for each election. Those poll workers are worth their weight in gold, but unfortunately we are able to only pay them the statutory fee, which is $75 a day. Given our COVID restrictions, that's actually gone up to $100 a day. Thanks to the CARES Act, they've given us an extra $25. We also have to pay for legal notices. Every time there's an election, we are required by law to run a complete registered voters list. We're required to run a list of all of the poll workers who have been appointed, so all 500 or 600 of those names have to be in the paper. We have to give notice of the election date and time, as well as the things that are going to be on the ballot. We have to give notice of the equipment that's going to be used and of the dates that we are going to test that equipment. And all of these things are not free to run in the paper. So we have to run those in our paper of general circulation, which here in Shelby County is the Shelby County Reporter. So what, you might ask, is the total cost of an election? Well, I can't give you an exact number for this upcoming presidential election, but I can tell you that we are estimating it to be close to $259,000. So we're talking about a little bit over $250,000 to run one election. Now, you might be thinking, yes, we can budget for that, and that certainly is something that we do, and we know we're going to have a presidential election, but think about all of the special elections. So if we have somebody who resigns from office or retires early and their position has to be filled, we have to go through the same processes, the same legal notices, the same poll workers, the same machines, all of those things to do that election, whether we have planned for it in advance or not. So that can make budgeting a little bit interesting when it comes to elections. All right, so now that you have some idea of what goes into elections, let me go ahead and start about the process itself. And I'm going to start with one of those burning questions: what about absentee voting? Now, in other states, and probably on the national news, you may have heard terms like mail-in voting, voting by mail, early voting. We do not have any of those things in Alabama. The only option that we have to vote, other than on election day, is to vote by absentee. Now, you are probably going to understand why people get these things confused as I go through the absentee voting process. So let me dig in and just tell you how that process works. In Alabama, absentee voting requires that you state a reason that you are voting absentee. And there are only certain reasons that qualify you to be allowed to vote an absentee ballot. To vote an absentee ballot, you first start by submitting an application to vote absentee. On that application, you check the reason, which is a statutory reason that you are electing to vote absentee, and you have to actually sign your name under penalty of perjury that that is the reason that you are voting absentee. Now, in our most recent election, and something that has gotten a lot of headlines, is that our Secretary of State, John Merrill, has, with the permission of the governor, set out that one of the reasons that you can vote absentee is fear of going to the precinct due to illness or COVID-related illnesses. So we are having a lot of absentee ballots come in and a lot of absentee applications come in for that reason. All right, so once you request that application, you need to understand that that application is not something that you can just send with your friend or neighbor to the absentee election manager's office. That application has to be either put in the mail by you, or delivered in person by you to the absentee election manager. And there's a deadline on that. You have to request that ballot, so you have to have that absentee information in by no later than 5 days before the election. And that's in any election. So 5 days before the election, close of business is when they have to receive that application. So what happens when they receive the application? Well, your information is entered into the system. The application is reviewed to make sure that you have checked one of those boxes that does qualify you to vote absentee, that you have submitted the required identification if it's required with your application, and then once all of those things are checked, you are mailed a ballot. That ballot is mailed along with several envelopes and instructions for completing the ballot. And that's something that it has to be followed to the T. If it is not followed, if witnesses are not provided as they have to be, or if it's not notarized, then your ballot will not be counted and will be rejected, and thus your vote will not count. The other thing to remember about absentee voting is that once you submit that ballot, so once you either put it in the mail or you bring it back to the absentee manager's office, it is as if you put it in the ballot box on election day. So you cannot have a change of heart and come back into the absentee election manager's office and say, you know, I've thought about it, I've watched another debate, or I've seen another commercial, and I think I want to change my vote. It is too late at that point. You cannot retrieve it once it has been submitted. All right, so what can go wrong with absentee voting? I've talked about the process. You know what to expect, but what can go wrong? Well, first of all, you've heard me mention the mail. We're mailing absentee applications, we're mailing ballots, you're returning those things by mail, and there are deadlines. You have to have your ballot back in, either hand it to the absentee manager's office the day before the election, or it has to be returned by mail no later than noon on the day of the election. So the mail service, you are relying heavily on the fact that it does get things there with certain deadlines. And if those deadlines are not complied with, your ballot may not count, or your application may not be received and issued a ballot. So what can you do to verify and make sure that your ballot or your application is being received in a timely manner? Well, the Secretary of State's office has a way to do that. You can go to alabamavotes.gov, and you can actually track the process of your application and of your ballot to verify that it is received. So what happens if I returned my application, but I never receive a ballot? Am I just out of luck? Can I not vote? Have I already sent that in? No. If that happens, you still can go to the precinct on election day and vote just as if you had never submitted an absentee ballot, because it hasn't been received, it hasn't been logged in the system, so you would still just be a voter on the voters list. What about the trickier situation where you've actually submitted your absentee application, a ballot has gone out in the mail to you, and you decided not to vote it? Maybe you decided that you just didn't want to put it in the mail. Maybe you were afraid you were going to miss the deadline. We have people all the time that they come into the polls and they actually bring us their absentee ballot and say, can I just fill this out and put it in the machine? Well, no, it doesn't quite work that way. Once you have been issued a ballot, you are not going to be able to vote like a normal voter, but that's okay, because it means that you still can vote and your vote will still count. But what you have to do is go into the precinct where you are normally assigned to vote on election day, and you do what's called a provisional vote. All that means is that you fill out a ballot, you sign in just like you would normally, you fill out a ballot, and instead of putting the ballot in that machine where you normally would, you put it in a provisional box, in an envelope, and that envelope has identifying information that then allows the Board of Registrars to go back and look to make sure that you didn't already submit your absentee ballot. If your absentee ballot was submitted and recorded, then that provisional vote is not going to count. If, however, that absentee ballot was never received, then your provisional vote would count. It's as simple as that. So that way we can make sure that your vote only counts one time, but that everybody gets a chance to vote. All right, so now let's shift gears just a little bit and let's look at in-person voting. You know, this was the area that got more of the attention. And there for a while, we talked a lot about election machines. And there were some questions about election machines and if they could be hacked and were they safe and all of those things. So let me go through each one of our election machines and talk to you a little bit about that. First, poll books. These took the place back in 2016, we piloted them, and then in the last few elections, we have used them exclusively throughout the county. And they took the place of paper and pen sign-ins. Now, it's wonderful because it allows us to process voters much more quickly, but it was also something that was essential because of a change in the law. We changed our laws in Alabama to say that if you voted in a party's primary, that you could vote only in that party's runoff. So we had to find a way to track who had voted in which party's primary, because in Alabama, you don't register with a particular party. The way that we were doing that, and would still be doing that if we didn't have poll pads, is we would rely on the poll workers to write REP or DEM next to each name. As you can imagine, that's fairly burdensome, and there could be some human error and some mistakes made in that area. So the poll pads allow us to do this much more efficiently and to be able to accurately track who voted in which primary so that we can then make sure who is eligible to vote in runoff elections if there are some. So what about the poll books, though? Is that something that somebody could hack or get into or change the results of an election? The easy answer to that is no. The poll books have no bearing whatsoever on the outcome of the election, the way that we use them in Shelby County. They only have bearing on who is eligible to vote. So yes, somebody could, if they were to get through several layers of security, they could hack into the machines and possibly change a voter's list or change someone on the voter's list. However, even if they were able to do that, you would have to have other people working in person to orchestrate this scheme or plan to keep people from voting. You would then have to have people who they had changed on the voting list go in and present valid IDs that then showed them eligible to vote. So what about if you left somebody off the voter's list? Well, we can remedy that too, simply because when you go to sign in to vote, if your name is not found on the voter's list and you can test that, you are still eligible to vote provisionally, just as I mentioned earlier with the absentee voting. And when you filled out that provisional information, we would then be able to go back after the fact, do the research, and find out that you had been wrongfully left off of a list. Keep in mind that one of our biggest assets too, as I mentioned, is your poll workers. Your poll workers are members of your community. So the poll workers are the first ones to let us know if there seems to be something not quite right. If somebody is coming in and trying to vote that doesn't have proper ID or that they don't recognize for the community. And keep in mind, they can't recognize everybody, but they have a pretty good idea and understanding of what's going on in their local community. So they would be attuned to those and let us know if there was a problem there. All right, so now we talked about poll books. And the one thing that I do want to mention to you, because it's come up on election days, and I just want to make sure that everybody is aware that the one issue that we have seen with poll books is the way that they work is they are supposed to try to match fields. So when you scan your driver's license, it could possibly come up to someone else if you are not a registered voter. So for example, if you had John Smith, Jon Smith, and his date of birth was December 1st, 1970, and John Smith was not a registered voter, but he went in to vote on election day and you scan his driver's license, there is a possibility that someone named Jonathan Smith, Jonathan Smith, with a date of birth of December the 12th, 1970, could come up. Why is this? Because the computer is set. It's not reading and producing an exact match. It's producing the closest match based on the parameters it's given. So we tell all of our poll workers that because we want to make sure that no one is questioning the process or that they assume that that means that there are voters in there that shouldn't be or people who are being left out that aren't. So that's one of those things that we have learned with technology and that we want to make sure that we are educating everybody of how the process actually works. All right, so now let's move on to the ballot tabulation machines. These are the DS200 machines are the ones that we use in Shelby County. And these are the ones that got a lot of attention 3 or 4 years ago when we were talking about machines being hacked that could affect the outcome of the election. These are the big machines that look like big giant trash cans where you actually put your ballot on election day and feed it in. They have a memory stick in them that is reading your ballot as it goes in. The issue came up a couple of years ago with some jurisdictions, none in Alabama, that were actually using machines that was a variation of this DS200 machine. And those machines had capability to connect to the internet. When those ballots were scanned, they could actually send and transmit the results from the machine directly to an election reporting software without having to move the memory stick, the physical memory stick, to a computer. Alabama's election machines have never had that capability, nor do we today. So that is not really a problem for us, but know that if you saw that on the news, that is how that could happen. If somebody hacked into that transmission, that they might be able to change some results in that way, but not a problem for us in Alabama. The main concerns about these machines is simply human error or programming error, which is why we have many safeguards in place to make sure that doesn't happen. These machines are tested numerous times. First, they are loaded before the election, usually 2 or 3 weeks before the election, with the memory stick that reads the ballots that are put only in that machine. The company ES&S, which is Election Systems and Software, comes out and tests each machine with multiple ballots running through it to make sure that it's reading the ballots accurately, that it would send back a ballot if the voter did not cast a vote in a race or if they cast too many votes in a race. And they do that with every machine that goes out. Once they test it and verify that everything is in working order, they seal those machines. Once the machines are sealed, we then come back in, typically 2 to 3 days before the election, and test them again, except this time we do it at random. So members of the different parties or the probate judge or other people who are just of the public who are wanting to come in and see how the election process works, they can choose a machine that we test. And we test it simply by running sample ballots through and making sure that the result that we know, the ballots that we've marked, come out with the result on the tape and on the stick that's in the machine. So in that way, we can ensure that each one of those machines are working and operating perfectly for Election Day. So here's a few other questions that I'll just throw on towards the end. First, can somebody actually vote twice? Well, I kind of answered that before. So yes, you technically could get your absentee ballot in the mail. You could vote that ballot, you could send it back, we could get that and have it received, and it would be set to be counted with absentee ballots. However, you could then go into the polling location and you could vote a provisional ballot. However, not both of those are going to count. So yes, you could vote twice, but you're not going to have 2 votes that are going to be counted. And a question that I'm getting a lot these days, is it safe to go to the polls? Well, 4 or 5 years ago, I think you would have been asking me about things like people bringing guns into the polling location or just general safety concerns like that. And I will tell you that Sheriff San Diego does an excellent job for Shelby County in ensuring that those issues are taken care of well at the polls. But what I'm getting that question about more these days is related to COVID and precautions that we are taking. So yes, we are definitely making some changes in the way we vote in Shelby County. We're making sure that, first of all, our poll workers are appointed to allow the capacity for the buildings and keeping with social distancing requirements. We are making sure that we're marking off 6-foot lines in the voting lines, and we're spacing the tables where people vote away from each other a little bit more than we would have otherwise. We've put up paper dividers on most of the tables in each precinct. We are also making sure that all of our poll workers are required to wear face masks or face shields, and that all of the tables and things are being cleaned routinely. The other issue that I'm facing a lot, and the question that I get a lot, is what about the voters? So if the voters come in, are they required to wear a face mask? Are they required to have their temperature taken? Anything like that before they come in? Well, that's a legal question. The legal answer is the voters have to meet certain constitutional requirements to be able to vote. That's anywhere in the nation. And once they've met those constitutional requirements, we cannot turn them away from voting. So one of those requirements you have to look at, is there a requirement that a voter wear a face mask to be able to vote? And constitutionally, no. The answer is no. We cannot impose that limitation on a voter. So what we have done is, of course, we'll strongly encourage voters to wear face masks and do those things, but if they insist on not doing so, we certainly will still allow them to vote. they'll come in and be able to vote away from other voters, so that will keep them safe as well as other voters. And then certainly if we were to have a voter who came in that was experiencing any symptoms of illness that seemed to be sick on election day, we'll actually have a separate table set up for them that they can go and vote. And then once they leave, the poll workers are instructed that they need to clean that area thoroughly and make sure that it's disinfected before they put another voter over in that area. So that's the way we've been handling COVID precautions and things when it comes to in-person voting. So I'm going to close by bringing us back to Shelby County. And I'm going to say that while I'm proud that there are 3 individuals who are listed as our election commission, and I'm proud to be one of those individuals, that elections don't run with 3 individuals alone, as you might imagine in a county our size. There are so many agencies and individuals that have to work seamlessly together to make sure that we can pull off elections in Shelby County. Now, we've had situations on election day where I've gotten the call that a transformer blew and we had no power at a precinct. And do you know, I call our county manager and within literally minutes, we have a truck there that is running a generator and we are back up and voting. We had a precinct that it was too hot and the voters were complaining that it was just very hot to be in there and voting in the middle of August in the summer in Alabama. Make one phone call to facilities maintenance and we have air conditioning units that have been delivered and fans that have been delivered. We had a precinct where in August we had only 4 poll workers, all of whom happened to be from the same family. And I got the call at probably about 5:30 the day before the election that one of them was sick and they all had to quarantine due to COVID. Do you know, within a couple of hours of that, I had community volunteers as well as county employees who had volunteered to come in and work the polls and get that poll open the next morning by 6 a.m. And I am going to go there. Chad Scroggins is probably going to kill me, but I'm going to go there. We even have a precinct that it was torn down prior to our last election day. And do you know that the county made arrangements to have a temporary voting structure? That's code, for those of you who don't know, for tent. But it was a really nice temporary voting structure. And not only did they provide that structure, which is something that they did to make sure that these voters weren't displaced and had to move to other precincts and get confused about where it is that they vote in the future, but they sent golf carts to move them to and from the precinct from their cars. And I had voters calling and telling me that that was the best voting experience that they have ever had. So all of those things just to stress how well our county works together and how it's not just one person. And it's not just about leadership. I was listening to an interview not too long ago with a retired General Stavridis, who his message was one that really rang true to me. And I'm going to quote this. He said, "Leadership is how we influence others. It's like a big door that swings, but that big door swings on the small hinge known as character." He went on to say, and I'll paraphrase a little, but he says that there are literally millions of books and presentations and videos on the topic of leadership. That it might do us all a little bit of good if we were to change our focus from leadership to character. And that is what I think is key about Shelby County and part of why I've always valued this program and why I'm proud to be a graduate of Leadership Shelby County and proud to have the invitation to come back and speak to all of you today as an alumni of Leadership Shelby County. Because with the elections process, as with other areas in Shelby County, you can rest assured that those of us in leadership are working hard to make sure that all of our voters have a safe and positive experience, that our elections are run with integrity and honor, and that's not just because of leadership, but that's because of the character of all of the people involved in the process. Thank you.